The courtroom was tense. Ethan stood, trembling but determined, and revealed, "I know who the real thief is." His words stunned everyone. What he uncovered would shatter the case and shake the judge to his core. The silence was deafening. But what happened next? Well, that'll leave you speechless. Let's start at the beginning. In a small town in America, 10-year-old Ethan Turner's life was turned upside down. His mother, Jessica Turner, a kind-hearted single mother, had been accused of stealing from the local convenience store where she worked. The charge was as straightforward as it could get. Security footage captured a woman taking money from the register. The police believed it. The store manager believed it. Even some of the townsfolk believed it. The evidence seemed airtight. But Ethan knew one thing for certain. His mother couldn't have done it. Ethan was no stranger to the world of injustice. It wasn't something he fully understood, but he'd seen enough of it in his young life to know when something wasn't right. Jessica had always been the one to stand up for others, especially for him. She worked hard, sometimes picking up double shifts just to keep food on the table and make sure Ethan had everything he needed. To Ethan, she wasn't just a mother. She was his protector, his superhero. The idea that she would betray their trust, especially over something as trivial as money, felt wrong. Deep down, it felt impossible. As the accusations mounted, Ethan's heart hardened with a singular resolve. He wasn't going to let this stand. He refused to believe that the woman who cared for him, who had raised him with love and patience, could suddenly commit such a crime. But there was no one on his side. Not in the courtroom, not in the police station, no one but himself and the truth he carried within him. The adults dismissed him at every turn. "You're just a kid," they told him. "You don't understand how things work." Ethan wasn't sure how things worked exactly, but he knew enough to recognize what was true and what wasn't. He had seen his mother face hardship before, but she had never backed down, and neither would he. The more he tried to explain, the more they ignored him. The police officers in town treated him like a nuisance, an emotional child who couldn't comprehend the seriousness of the situation. They brushed him off with an air of superiority that made him feel small, insignificant. The store manager, Mr. Richards, who had known Ethan and his mother for years, didn't even spare a second thought. He simply nodded solemnly as the evidence pointed in one direction. Jessica Turner was guilty. Ethan couldn't let this happen. He wouldn't let them take his mother away for something she didn't do. He spent every moment after school combing through every piece of evidence he could find, reviewing the security footage over and over, trying to catch something, anything, that didn't fit. He replayed the moments just before the supposed theft, looking for the tiniest crack in the story. But every time, it was the same. The woman in the footage looked like his mother. It looked like she had stolen the money. But Ethan couldn't accept it. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. "You always know what's right, Ethan, even when the whole world tells you you're wrong." And he knew with everything in his heart, that his mother wasn't guilty. Something was off. But what? Ethan spent his nights researching, asking questions, even sneaking into the store after dark when no one was around, looking for clues that might have been overlooked. He spent hours talking to people who might know something. His small, determined mind put the pieces together, but with every new lead, the truth seemed farther away. It felt like an endless maze. And yet, every time he thought about giving up, he remembered his mother's face, the fear and uncertainty that clouded her eyes when she was arrested, the helplessness in her voice when she asked him to believe in her. He couldn't fail her. The small town, once so familiar and comforting, now felt like a place filled with shadows and whispers. Everyone in town knew the Turners, and everyone had their own opinion. They had watched Ethan grow up, seen his mother struggle, seen them scrape by. Now, they only saw her as a criminal. The whispers behind his back, the sideways glances from neighbors who once called him a good kid, all of it felt like a weight on his shoulders. The guilt by association was heavy. He had to clear her name, not just for his mother, but for himself. One evening, as Ethan sat in the dark, staring at the glowing security footage on his computer, something caught his eye. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A small reflection in the glass of the register, a figure standing just outside the frame, obscured by the angle. The figure wasn't Jessica. In fact, it wasn't even a woman. It was a man. He barely registered in the footage, but Ethan's heart raced. He had found something. The discovery ignited a fire inside him. The evidence was finally clear. The man standing in the corner of the frame was someone Ethan recognized. It was Mr. Baldwin, the store's night supervisor, a man Ethan had seen around the store during his mother's late shifts. Ethan had never thought much about him, but now he realized something. Baldwin had been there, in the shadows, hidden from the cameras. He had the perfect opportunity to steal the money without anyone noticing. But how could he prove it? Ethan had the truth in his hands, but it wasn't enough. He needed more. His mother had no lawyer, no one to defend her. Ethan, despite all his determination, was just a child against the entire justice system. It didn't seem fair, but fairness had never been a part of his life. It wasn't about being fair, it was about being right. And right now, Ethan knew he had to fight for the truth. With a resolve that only a child who has seen too much can possess, Ethan knew what he had to do next. He had to take this evidence to the one place where everything could change, the courtroom. But how would a judge, a prosecutor, or anyone else take a child seriously? The thought terrified him. Ethan had no idea how to present his evidence, no idea how to speak in front of all those people. He wasn't even sure if he could stand up to them. The adults in his life had already made up their minds. To them, he was just a frightened little boy grasping at straws. But Ethan had one thing they didn't. He had the truth. And the truth, he knew, could change everything. The night before the trial, as Ethan lay awake, his mind racing with thoughts of the courtroom, he clutched his mother's hand tightly, unwilling to let go. She was asleep, unaware of his growing plans. He could feel her breathing, steady and calm, in stark contrast to the storm inside him. Tomorrow was the day. The day he would stand before everyone who had judged his mother and show them the truth. He would not let them take her away. Ethan's heart raced as the reality of the situation set in. What if he failed? What if they didn't listen? But then he looked at his mother. He saw the way her face softened as she dreamed, the way she smiled in her sleep as if she didn't have a care in the world. And he remembered. He wasn't just doing this for her. He was doing this for the truth. He was doing this because even though he was just a child, he knew what was right. And no matter what, he wouldn't stop until the world knew it too. The day of the trial arrived with a sense of heavy inevitability. The small-town courtroom was buzzing with whispers as people shuffled into their seats. Ethan Turner sat in the front row, his back straight and his hands tightly gripping the edge of the chair. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of it pressing down on him, his chest tight with a mixture of fear and determination. His mother stood at the defendant's table, her face pale but composed, trying to hide the fear that threatened to surface. Ethan had never seen her look so vulnerable. Judge Matthews, an elderly man with a stern face and a voice that could send a chill through anyone, took his seat on the bench. He was a no-nonsense kind of judge, known in town for his quick decisions and even quicker judgments. Ethan had heard about him from others in town. He was the kind of man who believed in following the law to the letter, without exception or hesitation. No room for mistakes, no room for mercy. His reputation alone was enough to make anyone nervous. Ethan was no exception. He had never been in a courtroom before, and the sight of the high walls, the polished wood, and the dark, heavy atmosphere made his stomach twist. He glanced at his mother, sitting beside her attorney, a woman with no real interest in her case, just going through the motions, her eyes barely meeting Ethan's. She didn't seem to believe that his mother could be innocent either. The doubt in her eyes stung, but Ethan kept his gaze locked on his mother, searching for any hint of hope, anything that might tell him she believed, too, that the truth would come out. Judge Matthews looked down at Ethan briefly as he walked in, his eyes narrowing slightly. Ethan could feel the judge's gaze on him, cold and dismissive. What could a child possibly know about justice? The judge thought. Ethan wasn't sure what exactly Judge Matthews was thinking, but he knew the man didn't expect much from him. After all, he was just a boy. What could he possibly do in the face of so much evidence against his mother? But Ethan wasn't afraid. His heart was racing, yes, but fear didn't stop him. His mother's reputation was on the line. The town's whispers, the accusing stares. It didn't matter. He wasn't going to let her go down for something she didn't do. His mother had always told him that truth was the most important thing, no matter what. And he had the truth in his hands. He just needed to find the courage to speak it. The trial began with the prosecutor's opening statements. The man, with his sharp suit and smooth words, made it seem so simple. The evidence against Jessica Turner was overwhelming, he claimed. The security footage, the fingerprints found on the stolen cash, it all pointed to her. There was no room for doubt. Ethan's stomach twisted as he listened to the prosecutor's words, each one a nail in the coffin. He could see his mother's shoulders slump ever so slightly as the prosecutor painted her as a criminal. But Ethan wasn't listening to the words. He wasn't watching the footage either. He was focused on the small notebook he held in his lap, his fingers tracing the edge of it as his heart pounded in his chest. This was the moment. Ethan knew that at some point he would have to stand up and say something. He couldn't just sit there and watch his mother be condemned, not when he knew the truth. But when? When would the right moment come? As the prosecutor presented more evidence, photographs, statements from witnesses, even a printout from the security footage, Ethan's resolve grew stronger. His mind raced, searching for a way to expose the truth without seeming like a child trying to play at being a detective. How could he convince these adults, these authorities, to listen? How could he make them believe that the person they were accusing wasn't guilty, that it was all a mistake? His eyes flicked to his mother. She was looking down at the table now, her fingers pressed together as if in silent prayer. Her face was tight with worry, but her eyes, though filled with fear, never left his. She had always been the strong one, the one who kept everything together. But now, in this moment, it felt like she was relying on him. Her gaze was full of unspoken trust. Ethan felt a surge of determination fill him. The defense attorney stood next, barely saying a word before asking Jessica to testify. Ethan's heart was in his throat. It was his mother's turn now to defend herself. But Ethan knew there was more to the story. His mother would tell the truth, but she wouldn't be able to explain everything the way he could. She didn't have the evidence that Ethan had uncovered, the truth that he carried. He had to be the one to say it. Ethan's fingers tightened around the notebook, the small, simple book that held the evidence he'd gathered. It was the secret he'd discovered, the proof that could clear his mother's name. He had seen it in the footage, the reflection of a man, someone who wasn't his mother, someone who had been standing just out of view, watching the register, waiting for the perfect moment to take the cash. It wasn't Jessica Turner who had stolen the money. It was Robert Baldwin, the store's night supervisor, a man who had been working the late shifts when the footage was taken. Baldwin's reflection had been visible in the glass of the register, just enough to catch the suspicion in Ethan's eye. Ethan had spent weeks piecing the evidence together. It wasn't just Baldwin's reflection. There were fingerprints left at the scene that didn't belong to his mother. He had found them. He had taken pictures. He had even marked down the timestamps from the footage. He knew what he had, but he couldn't just present it to the judge or the jury. They wouldn't take him seriously. What could a 10-year-old know about the law? What could a child know about evidence? Ethan's pulse quickened as he felt the eyes of the courtroom on him. They were all waiting for his mother's testimony. Everyone expected her to defend herself, to explain away the accusations, but they didn't know the truth. They didn't know what Ethan had discovered. It was almost unbearable, sitting there in silence, knowing that everything he needed was in his hands, but unsure when to act. The moment was slipping away, and he wasn't sure how long he could hold on. The judge was watching him now, his gaze hard and unwavering. Ethan felt the weight of the older man's stare and shrank back slightly. But this wasn't about Judge Matthews. This wasn't about the prosecutor. This was about his mother. This was about the truth. As Jessica finished her testimony, her voice shaking but steady, the courtroom was quiet, expectant. Ethan stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The room fell silent, all eyes on him. His breath caught in his throat as he faced the judge, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could feel the heat of the spotlight, the pressure of the moment, but he couldn't back down now. Judge Matthews raised an eyebrow. "What is this?" he asked, his voice low, yet sharp. "Do you have something to add, young man?" Ethan's throat felt dry, his voice barely a whisper as he stood in front of everyone. He had the truth, but how could he possibly say it in a way that would make them believe him? He opened the notebook, his hands shaking slightly as he flipped to the page where he had written down everything. He cleared his throat, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he spoke. "Your Honor," he said, his voice stronger than he felt. "I know who really did it. It wasn't my mom." The room went completely still. All eyes were on him now. Ethan Turner, the boy who had come to court to defend his mother, to tell them the truth that no one else could see. The judge looked at him, his expression unreadable. Ethan swallowed hard. This was it. He had to say it. He had to convince them. "But I can prove it," he added, his voice steadying. "It was Robert Baldwin, the night supervisor. I saw him on the footage, just outside the frame. He's the one who took the money." The silence in the room was suffocating. No one spoke, no one moved. The eyes of the court were locked on the small boy standing there, holding the truth in his hands. The courtroom was suffocating with silence as the closing arguments began. Ethan sat in his seat, his hands trembling, his heart racing in his chest. He had been waiting for this moment, but now that it had arrived, the gravity of the situation threatened to crush him. His mother's fate rested in the hands of the judge, the prosecutor, and the jury. The evidence against her seemed insurmountable. Every word, every piece of evidence presented during the trial had painted her as guilty, and the weight of it all pressed down on her like a heavy stone. She had sat quietly, her face pale and tight with anxiety, as she listened to the testimony, her fate being determined by a legal system that had already made its decision. But Ethan couldn't sit still any longer. He couldn't allow his mother to go down for something she didn't do. He had something important, that no one else knew. He wasn't sure how, but deep down, he knew that the truth had to come from him. It wasn't enough to simply watch his mother be wrongly convicted. Ethan had to stand up and speak, no matter how impossible it seemed. The judge, Judge Matthews, had just turned his attention toward the defense attorney, signaling that the trial was nearing its end. Ethan's chest tightened as he realized it was time to speak up. He couldn't let it go on any longer. With a sharp breath, he stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The movement was sharp and sudden, and for a split second, the entire room froze. Everyone turned to look at him, their eyes heavy with confusion. "Your Honor," Ethan said, his voice cracking, "I have something important to say." The judge looked down at him with a sharp, questioning gaze. His eyes were hard and skeptical, and he didn't say a word as he waited for Ethan to continue. Ethan's throat went dry, but he stood taller, his small figure suddenly feeling much larger in the courtroom. The air around him felt thick, and for a moment he was acutely aware of every eye on him: the judge, the jury, the prosecutor, and even the people in the back of the room. His heart pounded in his ears, but he forced himself to take a deep breath and steady his hands. His mother's face flashed in his mind, and he knew he couldn't back down now. With the quiet of the room pressing in on him, Ethan spoke again, his voice stronger this time. "It wasn't my mom who took the money. It was Mr. Robert Whitaker." He paused, looking around the room, making sure that every eye was still on him. "The store manager. He's the one who's been stealing from the store for months." A murmur rippled through the courtroom at his words. The judge's brow furrowed, and the prosecutor sat back, momentarily taken aback. Ethan could feel the weight of everyone's disbelief bearing down on him, but he didn't falter. He had the truth, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. "I saw him," Ethan continued, his voice growing more confident with each word. "I saw him taking cash during one of my mom's late shifts. I didn't say anything at first because I didn't know what to do, but now I know he's the one who stole the money." The courtroom fell silent again. The judge's gaze never wavered from Ethan, but there was no sign of the scorn or dismissiveness he had shown before. Instead, there was something new, something almost unreadable, in his expression. Ethan's hands shook, but he kept his grip on his words. He could see it in the eyes of the prosecutor. The doubt, the skepticism. No one was prepared to believe a 10-year-old boy over the evidence that had been presented. But Ethan wasn't finished yet. "I know it's hard to believe," Ethan said, his voice cracking slightly as he glanced at the prosecutor. "But I'm not lying. I saw him take the money with my own eyes, and I've got proof." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He hadn't told anyone about this, the photograph he had taken, the one that proved what he had seen. He knew it wasn't much, but it was enough to show the truth. He unfolded the paper, his hands shaking slightly, and held it up for the judge to see. The photograph wasn't much, just a blurry shot of a figure in the store standing near the register late at night, his hands clearly visible as he pocketed cash. It wasn't a perfect image, and there was no clear view of the man's face, but Ethan knew who it was. He'd studied the photo countless times, making sure he was right. The shape, the way the figure stood, it was unmistakable. Robert Whitaker. He had been there that night, just like Ethan had thought. He had stolen the money, not Ethan's mother. The room was still. Even the judge seemed momentarily lost in the weight of what Ethan was saying. The photograph was passed around to the jury, who examined it with varying degrees of disbelief. Ethan stood frozen, his stomach twisted in knots as the seconds ticked by. The prosecutor opened his mouth as if to speak, but nothing came out. He turned to the judge, looking for guidance, but the judge's gaze was still fixed on Ethan, who was standing there with nothing but the truth on his side. "This doesn't change the fact that we have clear footage of Mrs. Turner at the register," the prosecutor finally said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "We can't simply disregard that." "I'm not asking you to disregard anything," Ethan replied, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at his insides. "I'm telling you that the footage was wrong. It wasn't my mom who took the money. It was Mr. Whitaker. He's been stealing from the store for months. And you have to believe me because I'm telling you the truth." The judge raised a hand, signaling for quiet. Ethan fell silent, his heart pounding in his chest as he waited for the judge's response. The weight of the room hung heavily on him. He had said everything he needed to say, but it wasn't enough yet. It wasn't enough for them to believe him, not when the evidence seemed so stacked against his mother. It wasn't enough for anyone to understand the truth he held. Judge Matthews looked at the photograph, then at Ethan, then at the prosecutor. He adjusted his glasses and let out a deep sigh. The moment seemed to stretch out, and Ethan's heart raced faster with every passing second. The judge finally spoke. "This is certainly unexpected," he said, his voice calm but stern. "We will need to look at this further. The evidence you've presented raises new questions. The court will recess until further investigation can be done." Ethan stood frozen, unable to fully process what had just happened. His mother's eyes were wide, her breath catching in her throat as she looked at him, a glimmer of hope finally breaking through the anxiety in her gaze. She had always trusted him, but now, for the first time, it seemed like the court might too. Ethan didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if they would truly believe him. But in that moment, as the courtroom buzzed with whispers and murmurs of disbelief, he knew he had done everything he could. He had spoken the truth, and for once the truth was enough. The courtroom fell into a tense silence after Ethan's revelation. The air was thick with disbelief, the kind that comes when something impossible begins to feel possible. The judge, who had remained impassive until now, let out a loud, dismissive laugh. It echoed off the walls, a sound that sent a ripple through the room. "This is preposterous," Judge Matthews declared, shaking his head in disbelief. His voice was dripping with contempt, as if the very idea that a child could have uncovered anything worth listening to was laughable. He looked down at Ethan with a mixture of amusement and derision, as if to say, "How could you possibly think you can change anything in this room?" Ethan felt a wave of heat rush to his face. He could hear the judge's laugh ringing in his ears, feel the eyes of the courtroom on him like 1,000 hot needles. But something inside him refused to buckle. He had come this far. He had stood up in front of everyone, risking ridicule and disbelief, and he wasn't going to back down now. His voice trembled, but his words were unwavering. "I'm not lying," Ethan said, louder this time, his eyes locked with the judge's. "I saw him take the money, and I have proof." With a deep breath, Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the small notebook he had kept hidden. His fingers were shaking, but he took comfort in the familiarity of the notebook. It was his lifeline, the key to everything. As he flipped it open, his hands brushed over the edges of the pages, feeling the photograph he had taken, the notes he had jotted down in his spare time. His mother had taught him the importance of paying attention to the smallest details, and Ethan had done just that. He found what no one else had seen. The room grew heavier with each passing second. Ethan's hands were slick with sweat as he pulled out a piece of crumpled paper. He held it up, his fingers trembling as he placed it on the table in front of him for the judge to see. The piece of paper was torn at the edges, worn from being carried around in his notebook for so long. But it didn't matter. Ethan knew what it was. Judge Matthews peered down at it with skepticism, not even taking it seriously. "What's this?" he asked, already looking past it, dismissing it as irrelevant. His tone was sharp, as if to say that whatever Ethan was presenting would be as worthless as the boy's claim. Ethan's heart raced. He could feel the eyes of everyone on him, curiosity, doubt, and judgment swirling in the air. But he had no choice. He had to show them the truth. He had to show them that it wasn't his mother who was guilty, but someone else entirely. "This is a receipt," Ethan said, trying to steady his voice. "I found it near the safe in the back of the store. It's from the night the money was taken." Judge Matthews glanced down at the torn receipt. He wasn't impressed. "And what, pray tell, does that have to do with anything? A receipt doesn't prove anything, boy." Ethan didn't falter. He had come prepared. He reached into his pocket again, his fingers brushing against the other important item he had brought with him. The small slip of paper was the key, and he wasn't about to back down now. He pulled out another piece of paper, this one a bit smaller. He unfolded it carefully, trying not to tear it. As he revealed it, the judge's smug expression began to shift, albeit slowly. Ethan placed the new paper down next to the receipt. This time it was more than just a piece of scrap paper. It was a printout of the store's security footage, the very footage that had been used against his mother. This receipt was found near the safe, Ethan continued, his voice steady now, gaining strength with every word. But that's not the most important part. The most important part is this. He pointed at the printout. These are the fingerprints from the receipt, Whitaker's fingerprints. I found them, and they match the ones on the receipt. The judge's eyes flicked from Ethan to the pieces of paper laid out in front of him. For the first time, the judge didn't look so sure of himself. He leaned forward in his chair, his face tightening, his eyes narrowing as he studied the evidence in front of him. His hands moved over the printout, and his fingers hovered over the torn receipt, like he was searching for some kind of flaw in what Ethan had presented. The room, which had been silent until then, began to buzz with murmurs. Whispers of disbelief passed between the spectators. The prosecutor leaned forward, his mouth half open, clearly not expecting the turn the case had taken. The defense attorney, too, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes flitting nervously between Ethan and the judge. Everyone was watching now, and for the first time, Ethan felt as though he might be on the verge of something big. The judge's face had shifted. The cold, calculated authority he had carried with him throughout the trial was faltering. For the first time, he was uncertain. His fingers grazed the printout again, as if he was looking for a reason to dismiss it, a reason to write it off. But the fingerprints were undeniable. They were real. They matched the fingerprints from the store's security footage. They were proof of what Ethan had said. Ethan stood his ground, his heart hammering in his chest, his legs shaking beneath him, but he wasn't about to back down now. The judge cleared his throat, his lips pressing together as he sat back in his chair, clearly rattled. This is something, Judge Matthews said, his voice low and hesitant, almost as though he was speaking to himself. His eyes darted between Ethan, the evidence, and the faces of the other people in the courtroom. For the first time since the trial began, he was unsure. "You're telling me these fingerprints belong to Mr. Whitaker?" the judge asked, his voice edged with uncertainty, something that hadn't been there before. "Yes," Ethan replied, his voice steady. "I saw him, and I've got the proof." The judge didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at the printout again, his face growing more tense, his fingers tracing the lines of the receipt. It was clear to everyone in the room that the judge was struggling to maintain his composure. The powerful figure who had ruled the courtroom with authority was beginning to feel the weight of Ethan's words and the evidence, crushing him. It was a look Ethan had never seen before in the judge's eyes, but he wasn't going to let it stop him. This changes things," the judge muttered, almost to himself. He leaned forward, his hands resting on the table as he studied the receipt once more. He looked at the evidence, then back at Ethan, his expression filled with doubt. "Your Honor, I think it's time we verify this evidence." The prosecutor finally spoke, though his voice was tinged with an uncertain edge. "We need to confirm the authenticity of these prints." Judge Matthews nodded slowly, but there was something different about the way he held himself now. His confident demeanor had cracked, just a little, and a flicker of unease had crept into his posture. "Yes," he said, his voice slower now. "Yes, of course. We will verify the evidence. But this is serious." As the judge's words echoed through the room, The murmurs began again, louder now, as the weight of the truth began to sink in. Everyone in the courtroom was watching Ethan with a mix of shock, disbelief, and perhaps for the first time, a hint of respect. The powerful judge, the very symbol of authority in the room, was rattled. His certainty was slipping away, replaced with something he wasn't accustomed to. Doubt. Ethan stood there, feeling both small and incredibly large at the same time. The murmurs of the room filled his ears, but his focus remained on the judge. The moment felt suspended in time, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for the judge to make his next move. And for the first time in the trial, Ethan felt the weight of the truth on his side. The powerful judge, for the first time, wasn't sure of himself anymore. As the truth unfolded before them, Ethan felt an overwhelming surge of anger rise within him. It was a hot, sharp feeling, coursing through him, as if his entire body had become a vessel for the injustice his family had endured. The years of watching his mother struggle, the insults they had both taken, and the way the system had brushed them aside, everything flooded back. The sting of disbelief, the bitter taste of being dismissed as a mere child, all of it came crashing over him. This moment, this revelation, felt like his last chance to stand up for everything that had been wronged. He wasn't just fighting for his mother anymore. He was fighting for every injustice he had ever witnessed. The courtroom had fallen into a tense, near unbearable silence, but Ethan could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. His eyes remained fixed on Judge Matthews, whose expression had shifted dramatically. The confident, dismissive smirk that had once marked the judge's every word was gone, replaced by something far less secure. The mocking authority with which he had ruled over the room was being replaced by defensiveness, a weak, fading attempt to cling to control as the truth threatened to overrun him. The judge's eyes flickered toward the evidence again, but this time the weight of it seemed to be bearing down on him. Ethan could see the cracks forming in the judge's once unwavering demeanor. He had always believed in the system, in the law, in the power of the courtroom. But now, that same system was turning on him. The judge's gaze darted around the room, his mouth opening as if to say something, but no words came. Ethan could almost see the wheels turning in the judge's mind, a mixture of confusion and disbelief at the revelation, and at his own inability to control the situation anymore. Ethan stood taller, his chest rising with every breath. He could feel the weight of the room's attention on him, but unlike before, it wasn't heavy anymore. It was empowering. This was his moment. The truth was out, and no one could take it away from him. The judge, once so confident, was now retreating into defensiveness, trying to hold on to his authority with a tight grip. "You're just a child," Judge Matthews grumbled, his voice heavy with irritation. "You can't possibly understand the full extent of these matters. You have no idea what you're talking about." His words hung in the air, but they didn't carry the same power they once had. There was no sharpness in his voice anymore, no conviction. It was almost as if the judge himself was beginning to question his own words. The once imposing figure was now a man desperately clinging to the remnants of his authority, struggling to keep control of a situation that was slipping away from him faster than he could grasp. Ethan's anger, which had been bubbling beneath the surface, erupted in a quiet but fierce defiance. His voice rang out in the courtroom, carrying a weight of its own. "I'm telling you the truth. You can call me a child all you want, but the evidence doesn't lie. It was Robert Whitaker who took the money, not my mother." Ethan's words hung in the air, and, for the first time since the trial began, the room felt different. The judge's credibility, which had once been so solid, now began to crack, as if the walls of his authority were slowly crumbling under the weight of the truth. The audience, once hesitant to believe a child, now seemed to shift uncomfortably in their seats. The doubt had crept in, and with it, a sense of unease. Judge Matthews tried to maintain his composure, but it was clear to everyone in the room that his previous confidence was faltering. His eyes narrowed as he looked at Ethan, but there was something different about his gaze now, something almost uncertain. The usual commanding tone was gone, replaced by a grumbling defensiveness that didn't carry the same force. "You don't understand the full scope of this case," the judge muttered again, but this time his words lacked the same bite. There was no certainty behind them anymore, only frustration. Ethan's anger surged again, but it wasn't just anger for his mother, for the injustice she had faced. It was for everyone who had ever been ignored, dismissed, or belittled because of their age, because of their position, because of their lack of power. He wasn't just standing up for himself or his mother now. He was standing up for everyone who had ever been made to feel small. "This isn't about me," Ethan said, his voice steady, but full of the force of someone who had finally had enough. "This is about the truth, and you're not going to ignore it just because you don't like who's telling it." The judge's jaw tightened, his eyes shifting away from Ethan. For a brief moment, Ethan saw something flicker across his face. A recognition, perhaps, that he couldn't keep up the pretense anymore, that everything he had believed about the case was beginning to crumble, that, for once, the truth was being laid bare, and there was no way for the judge to dismiss it, no way for him to ignore the reality that had been uncovered. Ethan could feel the tension in the room shifting. The air was thick with it, like a storm waiting to break. Even the prosecutor, who had been so certain just moments ago, now looked uncomfortable. His brow was furrowed, his fingers tapping anxiously against the table in front of him. He had been confident in the evidence. His entire case had been built around it. But now, with every word Ethan spoke, it felt like the foundation was slowly crumbling. The prosecutor's eyes flicked to the judge, but the usual smugness had faded, replaced by frustration and disbelief. The truth was starting to seep in, and there was no longer a way to avoid it. Ethan could see the change in the prosecutor's face, the way his earlier confidence was slipping away. He was beginning to feel the heat of the mounting evidence against his case. It wasn't just Ethan's words. It was the evidence itself. The fingerprints. The receipt. Everything that Ethan had uncovered was now undeniable. The prosecutor's frustration was growing, evident in the way he leaned forward, his hands pressed flat on the table, as if trying to push the truth away. But it was no use. The more he tried to fight against it, the more it became clear that he couldn't. The judge, too, seemed to realize that the battle was slipping from his hands. His shoulders sagged slightly as he looked around the courtroom, his gaze darting nervously. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to losing control. He had ruled over the courtroom for years, never questioning the decisions he made, never doubting the evidence. But now, in the face of the truth, everything he had relied on was falling apart. His eyes flicked from Ethan to the prosecutor, then back to the evidence. But there was no longer a clear way forward. For the first time, it seemed like Judge Matthews didn't know what to do. Ethan's eyes never left him. He stood tall, his hands clenched at his sides, his voice steady despite the rush of emotions flooding through him. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to let them ignore the truth now. "You can try to dismiss me all you want," Ethan said, his voice sharp. "But the truth is right in front of you. You can't just pretend it isn't there." The judge's face twisted with frustration as he looked at the evidence again, his mind clearly racing. The prosecutor remained silent, his gaze focused downward, as if struggling to process what was unfolding before him. The room, once filled with the certainty of the case, now felt unsettled, on the edge of something far bigger than anyone had expected. Ethan didn't care about the judge's discomfort. He didn't care about the prosecutor's frustration. All that mattered was that the truth was finally out. and nothing could take that away from him. Not anymore. Not after everything they had tried to do to his mother. The judge opened his mouth to speak, but his words caught in his throat. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to make this go away, how to twist it back into the neat, tidy case he had thought he understood. For the first time in the entire trial, Judge Matthews was unsure. He was no longer the all-knowing authority in the room. The courtroom was no longer his to control. The truth had shifted everything, and it was too late to stop it. Ethan's eyes stayed locked on the judge's face, waiting for the next move. He wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to let the truth be buried again. The judge's credibility, once unshakable, had cracked, and now the entire case was teetering on the edge of collapse. Ethan had won, and there was no going back. The courtroom, once silent and tense, now hummed with an electricity that was impossible to ignore. The shift in the atmosphere was undeniable. Ethan could feel it in the air, the weight of the truth pressing down on everything and everyone in the room. The cracks in Judge Matthews' demeanor had become too obvious to ignore. The judge, once confident and dismissive, now appeared unsettled, his eyes darting between the evidence and the prosecutor, who looked increasingly agitated. As the whispers of disbelief began to spread through the room, the prosecutor, feeling the weight of the situation bearing down on him, stood up suddenly. His face reddened, his jaw clenched, and his voice, once smooth and controlled, now wavered with frustration. "Your Honor, this is absurd," the prosecutor spat, turning toward Ethan with a scowl. "This boy is nothing but a child. He doesn't understand the complexities of this case. What he is presenting is nothing but a lie, a fabrication. This is an attempt to undermine the integrity of this trial." His words were sharp, the accusation harsh and filled with venom. He took a step forward, directing his anger toward Ethan. "He is trying to manipulate you with false evidence. What he claims," the prosecutor scoffed, waving a hand toward the torn receipt and the printout, "is nothing but a childish attempt to save his mother." Ethan's heart pounded, and for a brief moment he could feel a flush of heat rise to his face. The prosecutor's words stung, but he wasn't about to back down. Ethan had already taken his stand, and there was no way he was going to let this man dismiss the truth now. The prosecutor was right about one thing. Ethan was just a child. But what the prosecutor didn't realize was that the truth was the most powerful thing he had in his hands, and no one, no matter how intimidating they were, could take that from him. Ethan's eyes remained locked on the prosecutor, his jaw tightening. "I'm not lying," he said, his voice ringing out across the room, steady and unwavering. "The truth is right here." He gestured toward the receipt, his hands steady now. "You can call me a liar all you want, but this is real. The evidence is real." The prosecutor's face twisted in disbelief, his posture shifting as he struggled to regain control of the room. "How can you possibly think that anyone will believe you?" The prosecutor's voice was laced with sarcasm. "You're a child, and this is a courtroom. You have no business trying to challenge the facts here. You're nothing but a distraction, and this is an embarrassment." Ethan stood tall, refusing to back down, his gaze unflinching. The prosecutor's words stung, but they no longer had the power to make him shrink back. The reality of the situation was clear to him now. He had the truth, and no matter how much the prosecutor tried to belittle him, nothing would change that. He wasn't a distraction. He wasn't an embarrassment. He was the one who had uncovered the lies, and he was the one who was going to make sure that justice was done. The courtroom, once filled with tension, was now filled with murmurs. People were talking, voices rising in disbelief, eyes shifting from Ethan to the prosecutor, back to the judge, as if no one quite knew how to process what was happening. The judge, his expression faltering, clenched his jaw tightly. For the first time, The gavel seemed to be out of reach, out of his control. The weight of the moment was sinking in, and it was clear that the judge, too, was realizing the magnitude of his earlier mistake. The pieces of the puzzle had been laid out, and there was no going back. Ethan could see the judge's hand tremble as it reached for the gavel, his fingers brushing against it. For a split second, the room held its breath. The judge's authority, once so firm and unyielding, was cracking before everyone's eyes. Ethan's chest tightened, but he didn't let his gaze leave the judge. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing. The truth had won. The prosecutor's attempt to discredit him had failed, and the judge knew it. The evidence, though dismissed and ignored for so long, was finally being acknowledged for what it was. Real. The judge's hand hovered over the gavel, trembling ever so slightly. He was losing control. His usual sharp command was gone. The weight of the situation was too much to bear, and for the first time the powerful figure behind the bench was no longer certain of himself. The courtroom, which had once fallen under the judge's complete control, was now filled with uncertainty. The whispers of disbelief were growing louder, and the judge could do nothing to stop them. Ethan watched the judge, his eyes narrowed in focus, his breath steady. He could feel a surge of pride for his mother, for the strength she had shown throughout this entire ordeal. But this wasn't just for her anymore. This was for everyone who had ever been wrongly accused, for everyone who had ever been dismissed, belittled, or ignored. This was his fight, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it away from him. His eyes shifted for just a moment, catching sight of his mother in the defendant's seat. She had been so calm throughout the trial, always the one to reassure him, to hold his hand when he felt unsure. But now, as their eyes met, he could see the pride swelling in her chest. It was as if, for the first time in a long time, she could finally breathe. Ethan had done it. He had stood up for her. He had stood up for them. And though the outcome was still uncertain, in that moment, Ethan knew that he had done the right thing. His mother's smile was small but genuine. It wasn't a wide, joyous grin, but it didn't need to be. It was a smile that spoke volumes, of gratitude, of love, of pride. The kind of smile only a mother could give when she saw her child standing tall, unyielding in the face of everything. Ethan's heart swelled, and the weight in his chest seemed to lift just a little. No matter what happened next, he had already won. He had uncovered the truth, and that was the most important thing. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, and even the prosecutor seemed to shrink back slightly, unsure of how to respond. His earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by frustration and uncertainty. He had tried everything to discredit Ethan, to tear him down, but nothing had worked. The truth had won out, and now it was clear to everyone in the room. The judge could try to regain control, but the foundation had already cracked. Ethan's eyes never left his mother's face. The quiet pride in her smile was enough to fuel him, to push him forward. He was sure now, sure of his victory, sure of the truth. For the first time, Ethan could feel the certainty of it. The truth had been exposed, and nothing could take it away now. As the whispers continued to fill the room, Ethan stood tall. His shoulders were squared, his chin held high. He wasn't a child anymore, not in this moment. He had taken the first step, and that was enough. The rest of the world might not have understood at first, but now they did. They couldn't ignore the truth anymore. The judge's hand shook slightly as it hovered over the gavel. Ethan waited for the final verdict, but in that moment he knew something had already shifted. The courtroom, the judge, the prosecutor, they were all starting to understand. The truth had taken root, and it wasn't going anywhere. Ethan had won, and for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that, no matter what came next, the fight for justice had already been won. His mother's smile stayed with him, a quiet affirmation that he had done the right thing. And as he stood there, the weight of the moment still pressing on him, he felt something inside him shift, something unshakable. No matter what happened next, Ethan had proven something far greater than he had ever expected. He had proven that even the smallest voice could make the biggest difference, and nothing, not even the judge, could take that away from him. The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence as Judge Matthews, his hand still trembling, ordered the immediate review of the evidence. The room seemed to hold its breath as the clerk quickly passed the documents to the jury and the investigators. Ethan's eyes stayed fixed on the judge, who, for the first time since the trial began, looked deeply uncertain. The evidence was laid bare, undeniable, and as the minutes ticked by, the weight of it all settled in. Mr. Whitaker, the store manager, who had once been a trusted figure in the community, was now under scrutiny. His guilt hung in the air like a cloud ready to burst. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, but there was a sense of calm, too. Calm that came with knowing the truth had been exposed. He glanced at his mother, sitting beside her attorney, her eyes wide but hopeful. For the first time in days, there was a flicker of relief in her expression, as if the crushing weight of injustice was finally lifting. She met his gaze, a silent exchange of gratitude passing between them. Ethan had done it. He had exposed the truth, and now it seemed like the courtroom was slowly coming to terms with it. The investigators moved swiftly, presenting the crucial evidence, the fingerprints, the torn receipt, and the photograph Ethan had taken, each piece of the puzzle falling into place. The room was filled with the murmur of disbelief, growing louder with every new revelation. Mr. Whitaker, who had been sitting at the back of the courtroom, his expression smug and self-assured moments ago, now shifted uncomfortably. He was surrounded by officers, his face pale as he realized that his secrets were no longer safe. A few moments later, the arrest was made. Mr. Whitaker was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his arrogance replaced by something else. Fear, perhaps, or perhaps regret. Ethan couldn't help but watch, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. The man who had stolen his mother's freedom was now paying the price for his lies. Judge Matthews, who had once mocked Ethan's bravery and dismissed his knowledge as the naive ramblings of a child, stood at the bench in stunned silence. His gaze shifted toward Ethan, no longer filled with condescension, but with something far heavier: guilt. It was as if the weight of his failure to see the truth had finally broken through his hardened exterior. The judge couldn't hide it anymore. He had made a mistake, and now it was clear for all to see. The sense of justice that filled the room was overwhelming. The charges against Ethan's mother were dropped, the relief in her eyes unmistakable. But for Ethan, this wasn't just about his mother's freedom. It was about the truth prevailing, about standing up when no one else believed in him. And in that final moment, as the gavel came down to close the case, Ethan knew that justice had been restored, not just for his mother, but for everyone who had ever been ignored or dismissed. As the courtroom continued to buzz with whispers of disbelief, Ethan's mother, Jessica Turner, was finally freed. The chains of false accusation that had bound her were shattered, and the weight that had been crushing her was lifted. The charges were officially dropped, her innocence acknowledged in front of the court. Ethan watched as his mother, her face a mixture of relief and disbelief, was allowed to stand and embrace the reality that her nightmare was over. It was a quiet victory, but for Ethan, it felt like a triumph that no one could ever take away. At the same time, Mr. Robert Whitaker, the store manager who had been caught in his lies, was taken into custody. His face, once filled with smug confidence, now twisted in fear as the officers led him away. His arrogance, which had been so visible just hours before, crumbled in an instant as he realized the magnitude of what had just happened. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as the man who had plotted the entire scheme was escorted out, his world crashing down around him. Judge Matthews, once so certain of his position, now stood before the room, his expression weighed down by the consequences of his own actions. His voice was unsteady as he addressed the court, the once commanding figure now humbled by the reality of the trial. "Sometimes," the judge said, his words slow and deliberate, "the truth is hidden in the most unexpected places." The courtroom fell silent for a moment as those words echoed in the air. For a man who had once mocked Ethan's knowledge, who had dismissed him as just a child, those words were a rare admission, a realization that the very system he had trusted had been flawed. He had been too quick to judge, too quick to ignore the truth when it came from the most unlikely source. Ethan had uncovered what no one else had seen, and the judge could no longer deny it. The crowd, which had been holding its breath, erupted into applause. It was a mixture of disbelief and admiration, the sound of justice finally being restored. Ethan, standing beside his mother, felt a swell of emotion that he could hardly contain. He looked up at her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was peace in her eyes. The relief on her face was immeasurable, and in that moment, she wasn't just his mother. She was a witness to the truth, standing tall beside him. Ethan smiled, a quiet sense of triumph and relief washing over him. He had done it. He had saved her, and in doing so, had restored a small piece of justice to a broken system. Judge Matthews, defeated and humbled, slowly stepped down from the bench. His once unshakable reputation, built on years of ruling with authority, was now forever altered. He had been proven wrong by a child who had seen through the cracks in the system and brought the truth to light. Ethan had not only saved his mother, but he had also reminded everyone in that room that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most weight.